The moment was not marked. There was no turning point that observers could later isolate with confidence. No statement delivered, no order issued, no visible confrontation that could be replayed or quoted. When the outcome became undeniable, disagreement followed almost immediately, not about what it meant, but about when it had even begun. Some argued the shift had occurred weeks earlier. Others insisted nothing meaningful happened at all, that the result was merely the natural settling of forces already in motion. The lack of consensus was not a flaw in memory. It was a feature of the event itself. The environment in which this occurred operated on familiar assumptions. Authority was expressed through response. Competence was demonstrated through decisiveness. Presence was measured by movement, articulation, and clarity. Systems were designed to detect these signals quickly and to escalate when they failed to appear. Silence within this structure had meaning only as absence. Delay suggested hesitation. Non-response implied incapacity or disengagement. These interpretations were not moral judgments. They were operational defaults, embedded into how attention flowed and how legitimacy was assigned, which is why the strategy that succeeded did not appear strategic. It did not interrupt the system. It did not confront it. It passed through it unnoticed, at least at first. What occurred was not an assertion of power, but a failure to meet expectation. And that failure, precisely because it was unexpected, forced the system to begin interpreting itself. Most strategic frameworks assume reciprocity. Action invites counteraction. Signals provoke response. Even restraint, when discussed seriously, is framed as a deliberate deviation, a choice made consciously against impulse, still legible as intention. This event did not conform to that logic. The actor, whether an individual, group, or institution, did not appear to choose silence as a move. There is no evidence of calculated withholding or conscious manipulation. The absence emerged from ordinary conditions: delay, indecision, competing demands, or simple non-response. It did not announce itself as meaningful. Meaning arrived later. Human systems do not tolerate unresolved signals for long. Ambiguity produces cognitive strain. When expected cues fail to appear, interpretation accelerates. Speculation fills the gap, not because it is accurate, but because it relieves uncertainty. This tendency has been noted repeatedly across psychology, sociology, and organizational theory, though rarely foregrounded. Power is often inferred rather than demonstrated. Those perceived as high status are granted intentionality by default. Their unexplained behavior is read as deliberate. Those perceived as low status are granted causality instead. Their unexplained behavior is read as error. The same silence can be interpreted as patience or paralysis, depending on who is presumed to be silent. In this case, the system resolved its own uncertainty by upgrading the absence. Silence became deliberation. Delay became patience. Non-response became control. The actor did not persuade anyone directly. The system persuaded itself. This was the strategy's first success. No argument was made. No position defended. No narrative imposed. The system projected meaning inward, completing the action on behalf of the absent signal. At first, the effects were subtle. Attention shifted. Competing actors slowed their responses, waiting for clarification that never arrived. Decisions were postponed, not because new information was expected, but because the absence itself was treated as information. Resources were held back. Plans were softened. The system hesitated in the presence of what it could not classify. What this revealed was not strength, but dependency. The system depended on predictable signaling to maintain coordination. When those signals failed to appear, it did not adapt smoothly. It stalled, not because it lacked data, but because it lacked interpretive confidence. The absence destabilized coordination more effectively than overt opposition would have. But the cost of this success did not remain external. The first cost was authorship. Because the outcome emerged through misinterpretation, authorship became unclear. Observers attributed intention retroactively. The actor was credited with foresight they may not have possessed. Silence was reframed as wisdom after the fact. Delay became evidence of restraint rather than contingency. This created a fracture between action and identity. When recognition is granted for reasons the recipient cannot clearly identify, agency becomes unstable. The actor becomes responsible not for what they intended, but for what others believe they intended. Future actions are constrained by a narrative that was never consciously authored. There is a subtle psychological tension in this position. To benefit from the outcome, the actor must neither confirm nor deny the interpretation. Clarification risks collapse. Denial risks demystification. Silence must be maintained, not because it is chosen, but because it is now expected. The strategy succeeds once, but it demands continuation. Historical examples illustrate this pattern with uncomfortable clarity. Diplomatic figures praised for patience later found decisiveness punished. Leaders elevated for ambiguity struggled to act without violating the myth that had elevated them. Institutions mythologized for restraint became immobilized by expectations of continued non-response. The initial misreading created advantage. The sustained misreading created confinement. A second cost followed, the narrowing of possible futures. Once absence produced advantage, absence hardened into identity. What had been incidental became performative, not necessarily by intent, but by consequence. The actor's range of motion shrank. Speaking became risky. Acting became suspect. Any deviation from silence threatened to expose the contingency of the original success. The strategy generated power that could not be exercised openly. It also altered how the actor understood themselves. When success arrives through misunderstanding, it becomes difficult to know what to replicate. There is no clear mechanism to repeat, only a pattern to preserve. The absence becomes both asset and liability. This is the point at which modern interpretations often intervene and fail. The strategy is extracted from its context and reframed as principle. Silence becomes tactic. Non-response becomes posture. Absence is treated as a reusable tool rather than a situational artifact. But what made the original event effective was not silence itself. It was unexpected silence within a system unprepared to interpret it. Once silence is anticipated, it loses disruptive capacity. Once ambiguity is fashionable, it becomes background noise. Once absence is intentional, it becomes signal again. Modern systems are no longer destabilized by non-response. They are structured to absorb it. Algorithms do not speculate. Bureaucracies escalate. Attention economies deprioritize absence rather than interpret it. Attempts to replicate the strategy today often collapse into invisibility, not influence. What was once misread as depth is now processed as disengagement. The environment has learned how to read the gap. There is also a psychological contradiction introduced by imitation. The original absence functioned because it was not framed as meaning. When absence is deployed consciously, it becomes communication. The gap collapses. Interpretation is guided rather than provoked. Awareness alters the act. What once disrupted interpretation is absorbed into it. This is not a failure of execution. It is a failure of transfer. The original success depended on misalignment. Between intention and interpretation, between action and meaning. Once alignment is attempted, the effect disappears. There is an overlooked historical parallel that clarifies this dynamic. In early 19th century European diplomacy, delays caused by logistics were repeatedly misread as strategic hesitation. Messages that arrived weeks late were interpreted as evidence of careful deliberation rather than infrastructural limitation. In several recorded cases, these misreadings altered negotiations more decisively than any stated policy. When communication technology improved and delays became legible as delays, the advantage vanished. What had once been read as patience became incompetence. The strategy did not fail because it was flawed. It failed because the environment learned how to interpret it. The same pattern recurs across domains. Once the system adapts, the absence loses power. Once interpretation stabilizes, ambiguity evaporates. Once a strategy is understood, it cannot function as before. This is why repetition fails. The strategy succeeded because no one expected it. It failed the moment it became legible. What remains unresolved is not whether silence holds power, but whether any advantage can persist after it is recognized. Some strategies exist only once, not because they are rare, but because recognition consumes them. The cost of being misread is not always failure. Sometimes it is being required to remain misunderstood. And sometimes the greatest limitation of a strategy is not that it stops working, but that it works in a way that cannot be explained, repeated, or escaped.